Within J.L. Mackie's error theory, everything is permissible. Now, if you've spent any time studying J.L. Mackie's error theory, you almost certainly heard something that's quite a bit different from this. What most people say goes something like this. Premise 1. The claim that an act is permissible is a moral claim. This seems obvious. If you're making a claim that an act is morally permissible, it's certainly a moral statement. You are talking about the moral status of some act. Premise 2. According to Mackie, all moral claims are false. This seems like a part of Mackie. He writes, quote, the denial of objective values will have to be put forward as an error theory, a theory that, although making moral judgments implicitly claim, among other things, to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive, these claims are all false, end quote. And from these two premises, we get the conclusion. Therefore, according to Mackie, all claims that an act is permissible are false. It's quite in conflict with what I'm asserting, that, according to Mackie, all claims that an act is permissible are true. So I need to argue that there's a problem with this standard understanding of Mackie. That problem is that on any reasonable interpretation of Mackie, premise 1 and premise 2 cannot both be true at the same time. If premise 1 is true, then premise 2 is false. And if premise 2 is true, then premise 1 is false. That is what I intend to prove here. So let's consider the first option. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that premise 1 is true. I'm going to argue that if premise 1 is true, then premise 2 must be false. A defender of the standard view of Mackie can complain that Mackie didn't just assert that premise 2 is true. Mackie gave us an argument for premise 2, and we saw that argument in the quote that I gave just a short while ago. That argument begins with the following, premise 2.1. Moral judgments implicitly claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. Premise 2.2. According to Mackie, nothing is intrinsically prescriptive. This premise is the heart of Mackie's book. He starts off with the claim there are no objective values. He then goes into a long discussion where he explains that what he means by an objective value is an intrinsically prescriptive property, some type of property built into things that commands that we either perform them or we refrain from performing them. An intrinsic property that commands that we perform some action makes that action morally obligatory or morally required. A property that commands that we refrain from some action makes that action morally wrong, morally prohibited. From these two premises, we get the conclusion that, according to Mackie, all moral judgments claim to be pointing to an intrinsic prescriptivity that nothing actually has. In other words, all moral claims are false. So, am I defeated? My claim is that if we assume that premise 1 is true, then premise 2 must be false. What we have here is an argument that aims to show that premise 2 is true. For me to make my case, there has to be a problem with this argument defending premise 2. Yes, there's a problem. Premise 2.1 in this argument is also false. It is not the case that all moral judgments implicitly claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. There are three categories of moral judgments. Here, we're looking at standard moral judgments. The claim is that standard moral judgments implicitly claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. So let's look at standard moral judgments to determine if they are in fact always pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. Category 1. Some actions are morally obligatory. If you borrowed $50 from your coworker and promised to pay her back, then you are obligated to pay her back. It would be wrong not to. Category 2. Some actions are morally prohibited. You are morally prohibited from taking $50 out of your coworker's purse without her permission. These are acts that it is wrong to do. And there's a third category. Some acts we commonly judge to be neither obligatory nor prohibited. This includes most of what we do in a day. My creating this video is neither obligatory nor prohibited. I violate no moral requirement if I were to stop working on this and instead go play a computer game. Here's the issue. Only Category 1 and Category 2 statements implicitly claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. Category 3 statements do not. In fact, Category 3 statements say that the act has no intrinsically prescriptive property. It has no intrinsic property that makes it obligatory, and it has no intrinsic property that makes it prohibited. It has no intrinsically prescriptive property at all. So premise 2.1, the claim that all moral judgments claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive, is false. Category 3 moral judgments do not claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. The defender of the standard interpretation of Mackie might want to insist the following. Mackie explicitly claimed that all moral judgments point to something intrinsically prescriptive. We have to accept premise 2.1 as true, at least if we're accurately reporting what Mackie says. Okay, so let's pursue this option and see where it leads us. Let us insist that premise 2.1 is true, or at least Mackie is claiming that it is true. We still have to deal with the fact that Category 3 claims that say that an act is neither obligatory nor prohibited, do not claim to be pointing to something intrinsically prescriptive. Consequently, if we insist that premise 2.1 is true, and we combine this with premise 2.3, then we are forced to the conclusion that Category 3 claims that an act is neither obligatory nor prohibited, can't be moral judgments. Now, take this conclusion and compare it to premise 1 in the original argument. Premise 1 of the original argument stated that a claim that an act is permissible is a moral claim. The conclusion that we reached upon insisting that premise 2.1 is true, says that Category 3 actions that are neither obligatory nor prohibited, are not moral claims. So, if we hold that premise 2.1 is true, we get the conclusion that premise 1 of the original argument must be false. Let's return to the original argument. Recall that this argument represents the standard understanding of Mackie. I'm raising the objection that if premise 1 is true, then premise 2 must be false, and if premise 2 is true, then premise 1 must be false. In the course of my discussion, I also pointed to a set of acts that I called Category 3 acts that are neither obligatory nor prohibited. For example, my creating this video is neither obligatory nor prohibited. A Category 3 claim is a claim that an act has no intrinsically prescriptive property. It has no intrinsic property prescribing that it be done, that it's obligatory, and no intrinsic property prescribing that it not be done, that it's prohibited. If premise 1 is true, then premise 2 must be false. If premise 1 is true, then Category 3 claims are moral claims. But Category 3 claims are claims that certain acts lack any intrinsically prescriptive properties. And if we accept Mackie's assertion that there are no intrinsically prescriptive properties, then Category 3 claims are always true. If Category 3 claims are moral claims and Category 3 claims are always true, then it cannot be the case that all moral claims are false. Premise 2 must be false. If premise 2 is true, then premise 1 must be false. If premise 2 is true, then all moral claims must be false. However, on Mackie's account, Category 3 claims are never false. Category 3 claims are claims that an act lacks any intrinsically prescriptive property. It lacks an intrinsic to-be-doneness that would make it obligatory, and it lacks an intrinsic not-to-be-doneness that would make it prohibited. And according to Mackie, a claim that something lacks an intrinsically prescriptive property is always true. Since Category 3 claims are always true, and moral claims are always false, Category 3 claims that an act is neither obligatory nor prohibited, cannot be a moral claim. If premise 2 is true, then premise 1 must be false. So what do we make of this? We could say that Mackie is guilty of a great contradiction, and that this provides us with another reason to reject his error theory. That's a bit extreme. I would say that Mackie wasn't thinking about moral permissibility when he said that all moral claims are false. Moral claims are claims about obligation and prohibition only. Interpreted this way, we get the conclusion that, according to Mackie's arrow theory, everything is permissible. However, let's not make the mistake of claiming that this is a license for unrestrained looting, rape, and murder. The rest of Mackie's book was devoted to developing an alternative, a way of prohibiting unrestrained looting, rape, and murder without making a claim of intrinsic prescriptivity. Here you will see a link to a video that I created on Mackie's alternative. In it, I argue how Mackie proposed making moral claims of moral obligation and prohibition, objectively true without the error of claiming that they contain intrinsically prescriptive properties commanding that they be done or not be done. In fact, this playlist is concerned with how the standard interpretation of Mackie is mistaken and how to correct it. I hope that you find something of value in it.